Hello and welcome to week 3, the Gilded Age, and this lecture we're going to be discussing women, and this will be followed up by a lecture during the Progressive Era on women as well, because a lot of things change and a lot of things don't at the same time, and we're going to see the fight back of change as well as the acceptance to some degree within these periods, and the roles of women traditionally changed during this period, the Gilded Age, because of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a new define of what is the expectation of women, not only in the workforce, but at the home as well in the domestic field. And this changes due also within class as well. If you are of a lower class, there is a lot of questioning on what is the role of women, and this changes because women actually participate in a large amount of the workforce, both rurally on farms as well as in industrial centers, industrial cities such as New York and Chicago, and wherever there's factory systems, there are women working. And the conditions and the wages of women working at this time is pretty abysmal. Not only do you have women working, but you have children working, and we'll talk more about that when we get to factories. You also have at this time women of the upper echelon, the upper crust. They have their own understanding of like what it means to be a woman and what's their role in society, which is very restrictive. And this is partially because a lot of American society mirrors at this time England. And this period is often referred to as the Victorian Age with regards to women, and this is after Queen Victoria, who rules from 1837 to 1901. And during this time, there are very strict guidelines for women of not only the within England for the upper crust versus the middle versus people who are in servitude, which means they work in the domestic field for other people. There are very strict rules, and these rules not only encompass England but much of Europe into India later with English colonization of India, but it also permeates into American society. And there's a lot of the wealthier women who look to England to get some not only fashion ideas, but also what is appropriate mannerisms, because they wanted to be accepted not only in the United States, but then also in England. If you've ever seen Downton Abbey, you get a little bit of a sense of this when uh, the women from America end up coming to the United States and how they're viewed as lesser and they're new money in many ways. But we're going to be focusing, of course, on women in the United States. And the question is, what is the roles of new women in this society? What is the roles of what they can purchase? What kind of textiles they use? What kind of fashion that is at this time? And the answer is what historians call the cult of the true womanhood. And the cult of true womanhood has several different several different guidelines that must happen. And this is piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. So that's piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. So these four virtues of womanhood, of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, I'm repeating this a lot because it's important, have contrasting thoughts as well. To understand what's the role of women, you also have to understand what's the role of men. So piety was considered the utmost of a woman's spiritual needs, the understanding that they need to cultivate traits that pass on to their children, and women needed to do this. So they needed to be to have extra piety to pass these traits on to their children, because women were responsible for the spiritual development of their children. Now, this is very important. Men weren't seen like this. Men were able to go to church occasionally. They didn't have to think of this a lot. And there's a rise in the role of men, of trying to get men back into the church, and so you have different men's groups that form. There's even this kind of cult that arises of the masculine Jesus, that he was a real man's man, and this is echoed in the YMCA at the time, which is which kind of has an emphasis in sports and masculinity, because there was this real fear that men at this time were becoming too effeminate, and part of that effeminacy had to deal with religiousness and with piety. And so to counter this is you have this movement of the real man's man, and that Jesus was like that. To understand kind of what the role of piety within women, there's a Dr. Charles Mangus said to a graduating class of students, "Hers is a pious mind. Her confident nature leads to more readily to men to accept the grace of God. So through women's piety, men would accept the grace of God." Seminaries and different try to aid women's understanding of God. They had the Handmaid's Guide to the Gospel, in Mount Holyoke College. They ended up having a guide to the women, to the Handmaid's Guide to the Gospel, and this kind of spreads. This is like how to understand the world. So through not only her religion, but also women also had to have the proper sphere in her home to make sure. The next virtue is called purity. And purity is the ultimate form of the true woman. Now, with this purity, a woman had to be chaste until marriage, in an effort to guard against men. And an example of this is Eliza Wood Farnham, the author of As Woman and Her Era, Volume 2, warned that purity of woman is everlasting barrier against the tides of men's sensual, natural surge. And what she's saying is that to have the proper barrier against men was to be pure. And purity was considered the utmost for women. And this is kind of all classes to an extent. Even in the lower classes, you see a divide between the pure woman and the impure woman. And purity was essential for young women. In fact, even if you didn't have this purity, you were considered unnatural and anti-feminine. And this is where you get this kind of idea of the fallen woman. Whereas if you, or fallen angel, so if a woman was impure prior to her marriage, it was kind of seen as that she has fallen from grace. Again, this echoing into this religious note. And it was at the understand of, like, so much so that if it was suggested that you were impure, it was considered scandalous to could affect whether you are married or not. Far more in the upper middle class and middle class that you get this divide about whether marriage will happen, but there's this understanding of whether you're a true woman versus your piety. A woman needed to be virginal, like the Virgin Mary. The ideal of true, her physical form should be soft, meek, weak, and without physical activity, and this was very emphasized. Women were often shown as being very excessively pale, of having softer hands, not being able to input things, not being able to physically do stuff, which is very countering. If you look at lower class societies, many who are women were more tan. They often have more callous hands. They had to work long hours. But there's this divide. In contrast to womanhood of being pure, men were expected to be experienced when they entered into marriage. They were not expected to be pure. In fact, at this time, you have a large amount of brothels and a large amount of prostitutes that are around to give the men the experience they have to have. And so often men would bring venereal diseases into their marriage from having that first experience As I said, men were supposed to be experienced going in. The woman was supposed to be meek. Men were supposed to be harder and vocal and without weakness. This idea of the anti-feminine men, and like I said, there was this great fear that men at this time were effeminate, and this was partially believed because they didn't serve in enough battles and enough war. There was less warrior culture, and these men were being too soft. And you see this time and time again if you read a lot of literature at this time. Effeminate men. And that is kind of the greatest mark against you, was if you were effeminate. So then the next quality of, or virtue of the true womanhood, the domesticity of the true womanhood, is submissiveness. And when the true woman must submit to authority and the opinions of man, and the true woman would not only have to submit but want to submit. And this is a good distinction. And as George Washington Burnap, on his lectures for the Sphere and Duties of Women in 1848, and this goes back pretty far, this idea of submissiveness, says, she feels herself weak and timid. She needs a protector. She is in a measure dependent. She asks for wisdom, consistency, firmness, perversiveness, and she is willing to repay it all by surrendering the full treasure of her affection, which is, again, her womanhood. If she's going to give her purity to be submissive. And so submissiveness is perhaps the most important of this besides the purity. It was expected of all women to submit to men. They were, again, men weren't supposed to be religious. They weren't supposed to be meek. They rarely had time for it. They were the decision makers, and it didn't matter. They were the movers and doers. Women had to be passive. A wife could express her views to her husband, but he had the final say. Women were supposed to hide their true talents. If they were better than their husband at something like writing or speaking or anything, they had to hide it. In fact, if you look all the way back to like Jane Austen, when she is writing, she had to hide her writing at all times. She always had a cover to hide her writing, because it was seen that even though she is one of the most prolific writers of the 19th century, she had to hide it because it was seen as too much, that she was not submissive enough, even though she writes a lot about being submissive. And just kind of understanding how extreme this is, like Carolyn Gilman's advice to a bride, at establishing this proper order from the beginning of your marriage, and these are written in journals and articles at the time. "O young and lovely bride, watch well the first moments when your conflicts with his to whom God and society have given control. Reverence his wishes, even when you do not his opinions." And Miss Gilman went on to further state in the collections of Southern Matron, said, "The three golden threads which domestic happiness are woven are to repress a harsh answer, to confess a fault, and to stop, right or wrong, in the midst of self-defense and gentle submission." So this understanding is that women are going to submit not only with their opinions or their views, but they also have to submit their bodies as well. And it was mandated that once a woman was married, that she would have to submit to her husband's will at any time. Just to understand how influential this was, it wasn't illegal in all 50 states until 1993 prior to 1993, you could not have marital rape. And it's passed in 1991 in England, but in 1993 in the United States, a husband could not rape his spouse. So a woman had to submit at any time to the husband's will. And this is really important when you're understanding, like, some of the great debates of this period, as well as into the progressive era. It has to do with birth control. And this is a prime example, because women did not have control over when they had kids in many instances. It did not matter what your what you wanted or what your body could handle. It was all at the will of your husband. So whether you could have children or should continue having children, even against doctor's advice, if your husband wanted you to submit, you had to. So this is a lot of people don't understand when we're talking about birth control that this is a larger issue, and an issue in many cases of life or death. And we'll talk about that more when we get to birth control.